In the early 2nd millennium BCE, Mesopotamia sat at the center of a world that explained itself through sacred stories. People asked the same huge questions. Who made the world? Why humans struggled? And how disaster reshaped everything? Creation tales and flood memories traveled between cities and along trade routes. They did not stay fixed. Each generation retold them to make sense of life, power, and survival. These stories often pictured many gods competing, negotiating, or fighting, with humans caught in the middle. Order came, then chaos returned. A flood wiped the slate clean, and a rescued family restarted history. The point was not entertainment. The point was explanation. Why did kings rule? Why did work feel heavy? And why did the world look unstable? Myth gave answers that felt dependable. Inside that wider storytelling world, a different kind of memory started to take shape among the people who later became Israel. Their account leaned less on divine rivalries and more on one guiding God who acted with purpose. Family lines mattered, not as trivia, but as a map of meaning. The same big themes remained: creation, judgment, survival, but the center shifted. It became about God and a remembered family story. In the age remembered as the time of the patriarchs, one kind of story rose to the center: family memory. People spoke of Abraham, first as a traveler who trusted a call and staked his future on a promise. That promise carried 3 simple hopes: covenant, land, and descendants. And it kept returning like a refrain. It explained why a scattered clan believed it had a purpose. It named a relationship that demanded loyalty. The story did not stop with Abraham. It moved through Isaac, then Jacob, where the focus tightened on inheritance and blessing. Who carried the promise forward and at what cost? In these retellings, divine guidance did not sound like a distant rule. It sounded like direction in moments of risk: when to stay, when to leave, whom to trust, what to endure. The family line mattered because it acted like a thread. It held the promise together. Then the memory widened through Joseph, where family conflict spilled into a larger world and survival depended on unexpected turns. Betrayal, separation, and reunion became part of the sacred story, not a side note. Each generation repeated these accounts, not as entertainment, but as identity. The point stayed clear. This people believed it came from specific ancestors shaped by tested promises. The narratives lasted because they answered one question again and again: who Israel was. Israel settled into the land and life changed. People still carried the old family stories, but now they also carried the memory of tribes defending borders, settling disputes, and gathering for common worship. These newer memories did not replace the older ones. They pressed in beside them. The same God who guided ancestors in tents now had to be understood in farms, villages, and conflict. Then the early monarchy arrived, and it pulled scattered groups toward a shared center. Royal courts needed shared history, sanctuaries needed shared meaning, and leaders needed reasons a people belonged together. So traditions started to travel. Songs, blessings, lists of ancestors, and stories of sacred places moved beyond one clan. They began to link up like separate trails turning into one road. At that point, remembering became a deliberate act. Storytellers and custodians of worship did not only repeat what they had heard, they shaped it so it could be carried by the whole nation. Ancestral accounts sat beside tribal episodes and sacred customs, arranged into larger story cycles. That work laid down a framework. Later generations inherited not just memories, but an organized beginning. The single kingdom had split into rival states, and the old shared story world had started to pull apart with it. Each region leaned harder on its own sanctuaries, its own priests, its own local pride. The same ancestors still mattered, but the emphasis shifted. One place stressed promises tied to land and kingship. Another highlighted older family ties and wandering. The past stayed sacred. It also became contested. In the north and the south, storytellers had preserved similar building blocks, yet they arranged them differently. Some versions sounded close to court traditions, confident and political. Others sounded closer to village memory, sharp about human failure and divine patience. Primeval tales of creation, flood, and scattered nations still explained why the world felt fractured. Ancestral scenes still anchored identity, but now they carried distinct accents, shaped by competing loyalties. Over time, these differences had not cancelled each other out. They had sat side by side. Separate written strands had emerged from separate communities, each claiming to tell the same inherited truth. That coexistence created a new kind of pressure. How could one people live with more than one authorized version of its beginnings? The answer had not arrived yet, but the ingredients had formed. Multiple viewpoints waiting to be woven into one larger book. Then everything broke. Babylon's armies crushed Judah, and many leaders and skilled workers ended up far from home, living in exile. The land that had defined the promise no longer lay under their feet. The temple that had anchored worship no longer stood. Without those pillars, older questions returned with force. Who were they without a place? What had their God promised, and why had it seemed to collapse? In exile, memory turned into survival. Stories once told at festivals or in family circles now carried a heavier load. They had to explain beginnings, not as nostalgia, but as meaning. The ancient claims about blessing land and chosen lineage had to be faced beside the reality of defeat. At the same time, the old theme of human failure sharpened. Brokenness was no longer abstract. It had consequences. So, a new urgency rose among the community's teachers and scribes. They gathered the inherited traditions, compared versions, and shaped them into a single, steady line of story. They edited, they arranged, they connected family memories to a wider account of the world and of God's purpose. This was not simple copying, it was interpretation with stakes. A unified story of beginnings became a way to hold on to faith when everything else had been taken. In the Persian period, the exile ended and groups returned to rebuild their life. They carried memories, laws, and stories, but they needed a stable, shared foundation. Scribal circles took on that work. They gathered older writings, compared versions, and shaped them into a smoother sequence. Out of this effort, a 5-book story emerged as a single doorway into Israel's faith. Genesis took its place at the beginning, not by accident, but by design. It offered the widest possible opening, the world's creation, humanity's failures, and the first promises of blessing. That opening did more than entertain origins. It set the terms for everything later. If God made the world, then God also judged it, guided it, and stayed involved with it. Then Genesis narrowed the lens from all peoples to one family line. Covenants with ancestors explained why this community mattered and why its story continued despite disaster. Genealogies and chosen lineage linked generations like a chain, connecting past to present. By the time the Torah reached its finished shape, Genesis worked as a front door, telling readers how to understand every law and story that followed. Power shifted again when Greek culture spread across the eastern Mediterranean after the conquests of Alexander the Great. More Jews lived and worked in Greek-speaking cities, and their everyday language changed. That created a problem and an opportunity. A sacred story people once heard in Hebrew now needed a new voice. Genesis had to travel, or it had to fade for many listeners. Translation became the turning point. In Egypt, Jewish scholars produced a Greek version of the scriptures that later became known as the Septuagint. Genesis entered Greek not as a loose retelling, but as a working Bible for real communities. Names, key phrases, even the sound of God's promises had to be carried across languages, and every choice mattered. Greek words opened new shades of meaning, and they quietly guided how readers understood creation, covenant, and human failure. Once Genesis existed in Greek, it moved faster and farther than before. It could be read in synagogues across port cities and market towns, and it could be studied by outsiders curious about Jewish origins. Greek-speaking Jews debated its meaning with new tools from Greek education. Then the text reached even wider circles in the Mediterranean world. Genesis became accessible, portable, and newly discussable. The audience expanded, interpretation multiplied. In the Second Temple period, Genesis kept its place at the beginning, but it no longer sat quietly. Different Jewish groups reread it to answer urgent questions. What counted as faithful obedience? What made a people distinct under foreign rule? How far God's promises still reached? Creation and Eden shaped debates about human failure and responsibility. Abraham and the covenant fed arguments about circumcision, purity, and belonging. Genesis stayed shared, but its meaning started to split. Teachers tied Genesis to law and to wisdom at the same time. Some readers treated the patriarchs as models of keeping commandments, even before Moses, turning ancient stories into legal proof. Others leaned on Genesis to explain order in the world, human dignity, and the pull toward violence, especially after Cain. Genealogies and chosen line mattered too, because identity had to be protected. Messianic hope pressed in, and promises to Abraham and Judah sounded like future headlines. Then early Christian writers reached for Genesis as if it had always pointed forward. They quoted Adam to explain sin and a new beginning, Abraham to argue for faith, and the creation of male and female to frame marriage and community life. At the same time, emerging rabbinic Judaism treated Genesis as the foundation for Torah-shaped living and careful interpretation. Both sides anchored themselves in the same opening book. The conflict was not over Genesis itself, but over who read it correctly. In late antiquity, Genesis did not just get read, it got organized. Jewish teachers gathered explanations into larger collections that later shaped the Talmud and the classic Midrashim. Christian thinkers did something similar, building commentaries that linked Genesis to doctrine and worship. Over time, interpreters stopped treating each story as an isolated puzzle. They built systems, rules for how to read. Those systems moved in different directions. Some insisted on the plain sense of the words, because law and daily practice depended on it. Others pressed for allegory, where Eden and the flood became maps of the soul and the church. In Jewish tradition, legal readings tied Genesis to commandments and identity, while mystical readers searched for hidden patterns in creation and the divine name. One book now carried layered meanings. At the same time, scribes worked to keep the words themselves stable. Jewish copyists refined what later became the Masoretic tradition, adding careful notes to guard spelling, vowels, and chanting. Christian monasteries copied Genesis in Greek and Latin, producing lines of manuscripts that shaped regional Bibles. Variations still existed, but the goal shifted towards standard forms. Interpretation endured because the text endured with it. Genesis no longer depended on a voice in a family circle to survive. It travelled as ink on paper and then as text on screens, multiplied in countless editions and languages. People encountered it in worship, at home, and in schools, often without knowing the long path that carried these stories forward. The reach changed the effect. A single book now spoke at once to villages, cities, and continents. This wider access placed Genesis in 3 roles at the same time. It remained sacred scripture, read as a guide to God, humanity, and moral life. It also worked as a cultural cornerstone, shaping art, law, and public language, even for those who did not treat it as holy. And it entered modern study as an ancient text that could be analysed, compared, dated, and questioned with new tools. That mix created friction as well as influence. In classrooms and universities, historical critical scholarship tested authorship, sources, and context, and the results did not always match traditional expectations. In public life, Genesis became a flashpoint in debates about origins, identity, and authority. Yet the book did not fade. It endured by living in many formats at once, printed, translated, taught, and searched everywhere, every day.